Past 9, I would like to call the McHenry County Technical Advisory Committee for April 9th to session, and we'll start with roll call. When I call your name, please just say here or present. So we'll start with Steve Bicking.
Here.
Michael Von Bergen.
Here.
Albert Schmidt.
Here.
Michael Warner.
Here.
Jody McCarthy.
Here.
Brian Valesky.
Here.
Bruce Meyer.
Here.
Gabe Powers.
Here.
Alex Strack.
Here.
Vince Mosca. We have Dave Kraft. Spring Duffy. All right, do we have Ryan Bieber? Okay. Ernest Varga.
Here.
Darren Olson.
Here.
And David Watkins. Do we have Daniel Tanyan? Okay. All right. I'll note those absent. And go ahead and we'll move into agenda item number 2, minutes approval. Do I have any motion to approve the minutes? Any discussion required?
So moved.
Okay. Motion to move by Mike. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Seconded by Ernest. All in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
All opposed? The ayes have it. All right. No public comment unless Brad, okay. All right, there's no public comment, so we'll move to item number 4. Are there any members' comments? Any members would like to make a comment at this time? No? Okay. So we'll go ahead and move into old business. So as most of you remember, a lot of these, what do you call it, the item 5.1, soil erosion control changes to the SMO. We started down this path from the MS4 changes that were coming. And what we tried to do was represent this from a point of view of laying out a goal. So anyone, I know the engineers in this room probably understand what the goal is, but anyone following along, any public member. So really the goal is simple: proper implementation and maintenance of soil erosion control practices on site throughout the duration of a project. So applicability, and this relates to what we discussed last time. We want to require some type of certified erosion control inspector. We went back and looked at what some of the other counties are doing, so a lot of this is getting pulled from there. But essentially, for the SMO, a qualified inspector is already required for any project that exceeds 1 acre. So one of the questions that we potentially want to answer is, do we want to require a qualified inspector for projects that are less than 1 acre where they exceed 20,000? Do we want to consider if they're in the vicinity of a flood hazard area or a wetland or a disturbance greater than 5,000 square feet? So the normal breakdown for a permit in the county is anything over 5,000 square feet. But obviously there could be some projects that, given the vicinity to some sensitive areas, maybe they potentially on the work they're proposing, maybe we want to require a certified control inspector. So before you guys answer anything, let me just kind of go through everything to tie everything together, and then we can come back and have a discussion. But essentially, the certified control inspector would maintain an inspection log consisting of weekly inspection reports and rain events that produce a ½ inch of water. Per some of the recommendations coming out of the TAC last time, we talked about the DECI program from Lake County. We looked at the SPS ESC, which is recognized by the IEPA. We looked at CISEC, which is an International Erosion Control Association. Those were kind of the three main ones that potentially would have recognition if someone has one of these certifications that potentially would, make them qualified. But there were a variety of other sources. One was by a company called EnviroCert, where they do their own program. This QESI, which is through the American Stormwater Institute, and there's probably a handful of others. So what we talked with amongst our staff was, well, this maybe looks like something, and to some of the points made is we want to try to be inclusive to people that might not be working in Lake County. Maybe they have another designation. So this was the idea of kind of developing some of this list, and it kind of reminded me of us of our certified wetland inspectors, where people would send in their criteria, and we have SWCD review that information, say, yeah, those qualifications make sense. So by the same token, some of these other sources, potentially that's where we can look to the SWCD again to kind of look at those programs, look at what they're about, and maybe make a determination to see if that qualification makes sense. So again, just another thing to throw into the mix. And then for the enforcement, we don't have, potentially we wouldn't have the staff to go through all the reports. So this would be a coordination item again with SWCD. If we're involving them, they're already doing the inspections for the major development, so it kind of makes sense. I was hoping Spring would be here to maybe weigh in on some of that, because I haven't really had a chance to present this to her, but we can get their take. I have talked to Ryan a little bit, who didn't think that this was in any way impact them. But any potential impairments would be corrected immediately if we had those logs checked. And Ryan would be able to go out to any site, or we can send an inspector, and we can immediately issue a stop work order for any neglect or disrepair if it's causing issues. And just to give you guys some background, like we'll get calls on anything, even a small project. The neighbor will call, hey, I've got sediment, it's coming into my sump pump area, whatever it might be. And even on a project that might look like this shouldn't be an issue. So then what we would like to do as well is update some of the performance standard related to this. So if there is potential issue, how do we enforce that? So one of the easier ways is if you actually see material deposited, you can say, okay, let's remove that material. But then how do you restore that area? Was there an impact? What do you do with sediment-laden water if we can document that? How do we say it needs to be dredged? What if it's downstream? So these are some of the issues behind that we face currently with enforcement. And we do have residents that say, well, they, in general terms, hey, the contractor needs to fix this. And it's hard to quantify some of this and really put it in a way that what type of cleanup makes sense. And it's not going to be one size fits all here. It is a gray area, but that's the full breadth of the kind of where we came to and what we wanted to present to you guys to weigh in on. So we can open it up for discussion. We can kind of go anywhere, or we can kind of go step by step and discuss maybe applicability first to figure out if this should apply to a number of different projects, case-by-case basis. So I'll open it up to anyone that wants to start. Ernest?
It happened, this discussion arose in the field last Friday. I'm sure most aren't aware, but to encapsulate, county is responsible for township bridge repair or replacement when that comes up. It's just the way that the rules came down when the Minneapolis event occurred. And as we go through a process, it's a multi-year process. One, to get the whole thing rolling, go through phase one, get it through phase two, which is what we were in the field for, the end of phase two, and then phase three is the construction. it's manipulated through a whole different series because the consultant that designs may be the same on phase one or phase two, may not. And then when it comes to actually in the field, the contractor that's chosen to execute the consultant's drawings, we act as REs on site. So last week, we were up at White Oaks Road, which is the far northwest corner of the county. We are looking at the bridge that is currently closed that we need to replace, that's fine. And I said, well, you know, deckies are coming, we're gonna have to really watch it. And the aghast of everyone was, why do you dare say that? It's not dare, it's coming, it's a matter of time. And so the next question became, okay, if it is, when are they looking at implementing this? Because that project, although we were out there yesterday for the end of phase, or Friday for the end of phase two, it's actually not going into construction until 2005. So we were kind of prepping everybody, getting everyone on board, final designing. And it then goes to IDOT in November of this year. So one of the questions is, when would this become start of implementation? Then another question that arose, well, could we, since we work with Soil and Water, could we ask them, although we monitor and we keep it up and we make sure that nothing happens, but because we're running cofferdams, soil erosion control, siltation basins, so on and so forth, to get stopped would be a very large problem, because if the contractor has to pull off, we may lose the building season that we're in. So one was how soon, two, and I wish Spring were here also to ask her the question, can we, quote unquote, sub out our decky to Soil and Water? So I just wanted to bring that up because it really hit home on Friday, and it bubbled in my brain anyway all weekend long, knowing this was coming up. So not that I'm against it, not that I'm thinking it shouldn't happen, but logistics also are difficult to envision.
Was that considered a major development? Did it exceed 1 acre? Probably not for just the bridge, or was there road work?
Well, see, we were playing with that too. Because we're going to have to widen and raise, because we're going to have to rework and remove the old bridge and place in a new bridge, and because we're going to have to deal with floodplain, and we cross the 5,000, 20,000 mark. Do we cross the acre mark? No.
Okay.
So it's a hybrid, if you will, and because it's so far along in the process, I was looked at and I said, well, this isn't going to stop us right now, are they? Because they're in that was the pre-final, yeah, we did the pre-final engineering field walk, now comes final engineering, and they're saying, well, do we have to do anything? I was like, I don't know. And they said, should we put a line item in the estimate? And I said, it's in its infancy, I can't explain it. So.
Well, let me just answer you real quick. If there's any permits that have been issued through the SMO at whatever time period, and there's new SMO amendments that we instill, any permits that have been issued prior would not be, it would be, you're now coming in for a new permit, and you're now held to the new standards. If you are under the old permit, you are held to those standards. So, yeah, I don't want to get into the business of trying to go back and track all of these open permits potentially, just to talk to that matter. But that's why I had this in here. You know, you're not quite to the acre.
No, we're not.
But you're in the 20, you're in a waterway area. So that's really the question that, you know, we want to figure out. Yes, Darren?
For an average site, I would recommend keeping the requirement at 1 acre for just, irregardless of the special management area or the wetlands. I don't think it's wise to bring that threshold down below an acre for an average site.
Or you got special conditions in there for projects that are in the floodway or a sensitive wetland area. You get kicked into that and make a change to that kind of situation.
Well, if that's the case, I'd rather have it in, I don't want to issue a special condition and then have someone come at me and say, well, where are you pulling this from the ordinance? And it seems like I might be signaling them out. So that's why, you know, if we want to have special cases or give not just myself, but the enforcement officers of the municipalities the ability to ask for a qualified inspector, you know, that would be part of this. So we can keep it to the 1 acre, and sites that are smaller, you'd have to come up with some language. I don't necessarily want to just throw blanket discretion at the enforcement officer. I don't think that would.
Cannot the design engineer go beyond the rules of the county on their own behalf and say, this is a good idea, let's, it's my liability insurance, saying, I think it's a good idea in a case like that. I'm out in the middle of a farm field above the wetlands, disturbing an acre or more. Again, it's two different things, but same point, some needs more attention, some not.
I like the idea of putting it in the ordinance if we're going to require it. It would seem to me like the areas that we're concerned about, I mean, obviously over an acre is one thing, but if you have, some of like like flowing water on the site where there's gonna be like cofferdams, I mean, that would seem to me where you would need an advanced level of oversight. If you have high quality wetlands on the site or within close proximity of the work, that would seem to be like an area where you'd want a higher level of oversight. I mean, if you're working on a site that's under an acre, but on the property somewhere far away is a wetland, I don't think that requires.
Like it's on the upland side of it.
Yeah, exactly.
I think slope's another one, still you probably want to think about the slope threshold.
Just to clarify, so, if you've got a Reed Canary Grass Farm wetland, that is a lot different than we just had a site where a pipeline was being put in adjacent to a Illinois Nature Preserve wetland complex. So those would be two very different things, but the risk to that high quality aquatic resource is very high. So sedimentation can completely whack that, convert it from a sedge meadow to a cattail marsh like that.
Exactly.
And so, that's where that concern comes in. So I guess it could be, specify a high quality aquatic resource as opposed to just wetland. But I just want to make sure that, we're all on the same page as to why that threshold is important.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I think not to beat a dead horse with like kind of copying Lake County, but I feel like their program has worked really well, and a lot of it's up to the discretion of the EO if they are like, oh yeah, it's high wetland, we don't have to worry about it. Like, and if we're kind of tacking on to their training, I don't know if we want to deviate too much, like can we just take what they have? Is there any reason we would not take what they have? Especially if we're training up the deckies from Lake County, then it's consistent and they're not getting mixed messages.
Yeah, well, the idea was we wouldn't offer any training. We would just, if we require, so we would potentially put in an amendment that now describes qualifications for being an inspector. And one of those qualifications can be if you hold a DECI certification. And certainly they are, the acre is their threshold as well. But, as some of these other examples that were pointed out, and they do indicate in there, they do kind of have it open-ended at discretion, but I'd like to put a little bit more guardrails in there and have it defined a little bit better, so that it's a little bit clearer for when the enforcement officer potentially should or shouldn't be asking for a qualified inspector. And then that was, again, I'm not disagreeing with anybody that what you guys have said, I think that was the direction we're going in, but that's the point of the discussion, is to all make sure that that's what everybody feels confident in moving forward with.
Darren, you have the WD open.
I'm just pulling it up right now.
Okay.
I don't have it quite memorized yet.
Well, while he's doing that, I will kind of touch on any thoughts on what certifications that all kind of make sense. Obviously, some of us will be SWCD's input and willingness to take it on, which I was hoping to get confirmation today, but I don't think they'll say no to it. So, and then one of the items that for this enforcement idea, we had a project in the municipality where they were pumping water to install utility. and it was going into a channel, and you could visibly see the sediment running into the channel. And ultimately, it was Army Corps jurisdiction, but they're not deciding to do anything. So what would be, that's just one example potentially, but what would the enforcement and the standards for enforcement look like in terms of a cleanup? And that might also need to involve the state's attorney's office with some of those type of questions. So the issue becomes where we're saying, oh, well, don't worry, IEPA,
Yeah.
why, Army Corps is involved, it's a discharge. Basically, nothing's gonna happen on that project. And I'm not saying that there were, tons of sediments deposited, it's hard to quantify realistically. But those government agencies sometimes don't come through for some of those reasons. So it just would kind of give us some type of framework to have an ability that if it was something that negligent that definitely needs to be repaired, that now we have something to where if they say no, then we can give something to the state's attorney where they have some firepower essentially.
What enforcement tools do you have that are available to you in the SMO?
Not much.
Do you have a section that, like an enforcement section in the SMO?
I mean, yes, there's an enforcement section, but it all ties back to like what part of the ordinance are we trying to enforce? So if there's a lack of sediment erosion control, it's a gray area to say, well, you gotta clean up. And the easy one is, okay, you're on a property line, you've got silt fence and the material spills over, right? That's just, okay, let's scoop up the material and get it out of there. But there's no guidelines for that. So I don't know necessarily how to word that, or the enforcement is not put in a way that would say that you have caused, I don't want to use damage, but for lack of a better legal word, damage to a certain property or something that needs to be corrected. And there's no indication of, okay, you scoop up that material, but maybe it's remained there for so long, if it's a wetland or something like that, how do you restore that properly? There's no real way. I mean, we can go after someone and say, you need to do X, Y, and Z. But again, if they say, no, not gonna do it, that's where having something in there to point to it, to indicate what needs to be done is kind of what this section is meant to represent or ask the question. And even if there is something, I'll go back and look, Mike, for specifically some of the sections, but it's all kind of tied towards these performance standards that you go through the erosion control. And then there it says, well, you gotta do it this way and that way, but it doesn't really go into, well, now you've deposited sediment on a neighboring property. What happens now? And it doesn't necessarily have to be, if it is an acre and it's on a neighbor or on a farm field or something, just the responsible party for that, et cetera, for that type of process.
I think, so just from my role at Lake County, probably our most effective enforcement tool was a stop work order. So, nobody wants to stop work, so they just want to continue. And so if you say, I don't think that we had the ability to do, to require cleanup, but if there was a spill into a wetland that was aided, the Corps does. And we would, say, okay, well, we're bringing the Corps in if you don't clean it up. And they would issue monetary fines also. But if you're in a situation, that the Corps says, well, we're not coming out, then, I think the stop work order, you could use it as a tool to say, well, or you could say that you've impacted this wetland. So now you have to either clean it up or mitigate for it, depending on how bad that is. But also the stop work order would be used to, to require additional erosion control measures to be put in place. So if they should have been in a situation where maybe they should be using a flocculant, it's pump discharge or something like that, then you could try to work with the developer to put in some kind of flock system. But typically, those, the other enforcement tool that we had was, I mentioned it last meeting, was we would have inspection deposits. And that could be tied to, the 1 acre sites or whatever, you could set a limit. And so if they didn't fix it up, the repeat inspection time was basically charged to them. So it wasn't like, it was basically trying to offset the additional staff costs that are being created because you have to go out there again. That's just a suggestion, but the stop work orders, at a minimum, I think were the best enforcement tool.
Still, I have a question regarding the inspection for the erosion when the saltwater district is involved. I've seen the letters that some of my clients get, cleaning it up. If they don't, when the client doesn't do it, which I haven't seen yet, is there not any meat to that inspection that the stormwater, I guess, is that kind of broken, or is there not enough enforcement there? If they don't follow what the recommendations of the inspector? Or you try to take that onus off them and go into a decky?
Well, yeah, so some of the things that we mentioned for the enforcement would be related to those, procedures and the stop work order and having the decky log to help catch that, while it's happening. So potentially, some of these issues would start to decrease or happen less often. The example that I gave specifically was something that I had looked at even when Joanna was here to try to see what type of enforcement capabilities we had for if they were discharging, pumping, and mind you, they had a sediment tank, they had all this. I mean, if I show you the picture, they had an open cut in the right of way, and they had their filter bag sitting in the cut in the muddy water, right? So they pumping the water into the bag going into the muddy water. And it was just constantly having to stay on them. And, understandably, we're going to have those sites. But at the end of the day, when we were looking at everything, we just really couldn't find a way to really cite something in the ordinance that would say, okay, you guys, we're going to enforce a fine per day that you've had this sediment control violation that we've been able to document it. Or, we're going to ask you to dredge the channel or something in relation to, it was, okay, they're not keeping up with their soil erosion control, so what are we asking them to do? That was the question. Are we imposing a fine because they're not doing it? Are we asking for some kind of cleanup? Because cleanup is definitely not in the ordinance. That's really hard to enforce. I get that from, what Michael was even saying and what that looks like. It's probably could never, the contractor's always gonna want to do less in most situations. You mentioned, out of the goodness of their heart, couldn't they do more? I'd love it, but that doesn't usually happen, or if it does, it doesn't happen enough. So that was what we were up against. What are we going to ask them to do? And some of the things they were coming back with was, well, here's my turbidity, here's this, here's my, here's that. And I was like, well, here's an Army Corps letter that says you're discharging sediment. And, they issued a stop work order to them. They did. And they're supposed to tighten things up, but we still continue to have issues with that site even moving forward. And we have plenty of pictures when they're there was one time where it got really cold, the portion of the channel froze over, you could see the sediment frozen in the river. It had turbidity current that wasn't kept. So Ryan kept saying, you need to do this, you need to do that, but at the end of the day, They're like, you know, there was no, that's what I mean. We didn't really have anything to say, you're getting fined for all of these days that you had issues with your erosion control. So that's really where it stemmed from. And to Jody's point, you know, we were working with the IEPA, and at the end of the day, they said, sorry, we can't use Ryan's reports because we didn't have an IEPA member out there. So that's where a lot of kind of what I put in this enforcement was try to get kind of some of the simple things of stop work order and all of that. But at the end of the day, even if we have that, there, you know, with a site like that, how do you really get someone to feel the need, like, okay, we gotta stop, you know, we gotta up our game for soil erosion control and all of that. So we even had a meeting with them.
So it wasn't considered a violation of their permit?
Well, you know, it was, again, it was kind of through the soil erosion control portion of it, but yeah, we had them do a stop work order, the Army Corps had them do a stop work order, but you know, the other question was, what if there was damage done? And it's to a resident. The residents there did not feel like they were being protected, I'll put it that way. And this could happen on any property, a farm field, a community, your backyard. People just call and are looking to be protected. And yeah, I tell them, well, yeah, they need soil erosion control and we do inspections and stuff like that, but there's cases where, okay, now I have damage to my property, you're gonna tell me that I need to hire someone to come and haul this muck off or do whatever on my dime. And that's what I'm saying, the ordinance doesn't have an ability, or we ask that question, what are we asking them to do? Are we asking them to pay a fine? Are we asking them to somehow clean up the area? So that's where we got stuck.
I have to step out.
Okay, yeah, if you need to go, Al, that's fine. I know you have other engagements, so.
See you guys next time. Thanks.
Is there any mechanism for enforcement in the overall county ordinance, not just the SMO, that could be referred to? Because like I'm looking right now at Lake Counties, and they have Article 12, which is like literally lays out stop work order, fines, legal actions. I would imagine the overall county ordinance might have something that we could refer to.
I think the SMO, Article 9, under violation and penalty,
Yeah.
it talks
Oh, okay,
about,
it was in 10.
it talks about the stop work orders, and it, under number 6, it says the EO can take legal action, and
This one?
yeah, under number 6, C6, it says you can require them to clean it up. Require removal, correction, remediation, or mitigation. It looks like kind of the bones are there for what you're looking for. And it also talks about stop work order, and that the fees are, you know, that you can recover attorney's fees and stuff like that too, so.
Seemed like the dollar figure there was pretty low, though. It was like
It's not even gonna pay for your lawyer, not even an hour.
$100, it looked like.
$100 previously, yeah.
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 It was, yeah, well, this is the main language. So yes, there are, it is in here with an opportunity for the EO to seek some of this. It's just the problem with soil erosion control is what do I say is the corrective action or the remediation? Because I'd have to point back to the soil erosion control performance standards. And that's where I feel like it's like the link is there, but I feel like if I try to go after someone and ask the state's attorney to say, okay, these guys have to dredge the channel because we've documented discharge of sediments through pumping.
Right. So
I feel like it becomes hard to implement it,
Yeah.
even though it's here, and that's kind of, I guess that's what I probably should have put, is kind of the implementation of this language when it's related to soil erosion control and the type of cleanup, the type of correction that's required. if it's something simple, like you see the dirt there, it's over and just like, okay, you gotta bring that stockpile back. And that's a little bit more straightforward. And I don't think any contractor would say like, yeah, would disagree with it at that point. But, for this one, yeah, I mean, these guys were like, well, here's a turbidity test. He was looking at me and saying, what do you classify this as a discharge of sediment? Like, I can visually see it. And so they were trying to use other tools to say, well, it meets the, standard for turbidity, or it meets the standard for this.
Mike, whatever happened to those EPA standards that came out at one time? They were remember they tried to push turbidity standard?
NTUs.
Yeah.
Yeah, it got rolled back at the federal level, so it was kind of a national political battle. And the US EPA ultimately pulled back on that and didn't require it. And so we had developed language for the WDO to match what the US EPA was saying was coming out. And then once they pulled it back, we left the language there and just said that this can be used at the community level if the community desires it. So we left all, the NTUs based on the specific water bodies as a reference in the ordinance, but it wasn't become regulatory. But I would agree with Jody that if you do adopt the DECI program, the advantage of that in your situation that you're describing is that the DECI takes pictures, every week of the site. And then you can tell what it looked like, before the violation and then what the violation caused. So that you can say, look, here's your evidence, basically.
I think even better than that, the DECI is the one who is essentially self-reporting the violation, that they're calling it what it is. And if you, as the enforcement officer, think that they're not reporting it, then you can go after the DECI, right? They're essentially the one that is taking responsibility for it.
Well, I guess we don't, how would I go after them would be my question to you.
You could revoke their status.
But they're getting their DECI status through Lake County, we're not really providing it. So we would, do you see what I'm, like their certifications, there's an outside program that then we're saying, okay, you're qualified because you have the certification, but I don't think I would have the ability to then say, you can't hang on to your DECI because it's not a program that McHenry County administers.
You can notify.
I could, so I could, but some of these other organizations, then we would, again, be stripping the list down potentially, and I don't know, like the one that was the CCP.
Weren't you gonna create a separate erosion and control inspector and
Well-
then just base that requirement on being a DECI?
That's what I was thinking that you were doing.
We were thinking about that, but I don't know that we necessarily have the staff and ability to run that type of program.
There's a notification process in the WDO for a DECI that doesn't perform.
Okay.
So it's basically, I think it's like a 3 strikes, you're out system.
Okay, because that was the teeth in that idea is, yeah, if I can go after the DECI, then I have an ability to inadvertently kind of make sure that people are doing it correctly, but I wasn't sure if we didn't run our own program, and then if we did run our own program, then we would only require them to be certified through us, then I can definitely pull that certification. But if we allow, because I really liked your idea of allowing others, if they're certified in other programs, to be able to, be.
But couldn't you run the program and say that the only requirement for being in this program is that we allow you to be on the list, and number 2 is you fall into one of these categories. And so if the 3 strikes and they're out, then they don't meet number 1, which is you allow them to be on the list.
Well, that is very similar to the wetland specialist program that we have now. We don't actually do any training or anything like that.
We can, that's definitely something that we can do. We can create a similar list and hold it, and people would have to send in their application. We would And then that would also give the SMSC an ability to ask for further information for anyone as well, because that's how the wetland program is geared. It goes through the Stormwater Commission, or technically it goes through that, but we kind of operated with an understanding that if they're gonna meet the standards, we don't need to send everyone through. So yeah, we could, if that's exactly what I was asking the question. I think if that seems the most likely outcome of stop work orders and having that list to then have consequences, then we can certainly proceed in that fashion. And what staff can do is then take all of this and maybe turn it into some language for the next time, or get it close to that to give it back to you guys to look at all the details again. So, the reason I created this was not necessarily, again, was to drive this discussion, which is what I wanted. I thought I had an idea of kind of the direction you guys would go, but that's why I left it kind of open-ended with these questions.
Yeah. One other thing we have to give some credence. In Lake County, the DECIs, I can use that training to maintain wetland specialists. I sit through DECI trainings, and I sat through last year. They had a major field exercise. They also had their annual this year. And one of the things that they bring forth and pound in is, remember that as DECIs, you can propose corrective measures. So they give them some power, okay? But on a little bit separate note from that, I just wanted that kind of noted. We kind of had some of these situations occur with the organics. Now, there were two hammers that we had. Your department had a hammer, occupancy. Our department had a hammer, since they were within our right-of-way, we had them post the bond. Now, this doesn't have bonding, our ordinance does. Anytime work in the right-of-way is done, there is a mark set, it's always over 100%. You say, give me the engineer's estimate, okay, hit it by this excess percentage. Now, hand us a bond. Now, it takes a little tracking, because you got to follow up, and the bonds are only usually issued for a year, and so on and so forth. But the reason they were so responsive within the right-of-way was that bond hanging over them. And the bond, it's fine to say $1 million, you buy it at 2 or 3%, because it's like a bookie hedging a bet at the racetrack. But if it gets called on you, well, it's like bookie coming and saying, now pay up your damn debt. In my 16 years, we one time had to pull that hammer out, if you will, and as soon as we executed it, you have to realize we were issued the entirety of that amount. So take, using organics, a small infringement, had they pushed it to the limit, we take out a huge amount of money against them. We have to return back whatever is not used, but now that money is ours to go to whatever contractor we want and say, you're going to do what we're saying, you're going to follow these plans, you're not going to just go willy-nilly like the one before you did. And so this is scary. Those bonds, when you start saying, okay, if you're not going to get it done, bond comes due, oh my God, you wouldn't believe the responsiveness and action you get. And so maybe we want to look at an over 100% bonding?
Slight issue there. You guys own the right-of-way. This would be McHenry County going onto private property doing work.
But with subdivisions, when a township has a subdivision coming in and there is roadway being installed and it has not yet finished all dedication and everything else, the township gets a bond so that that road can be completed.
For subdivisions, yes.
Okay. I guess I understand your quandary, but I don't know. I wonder if state's attorney wouldn't say, hey, yeah, you do have enough. It's just spitballing.
So I don't want to pivot too much, but we do have some language in the SMO related to development and this idea of taking the outfall from the detention basin to a known point through a property correctly. And we do indicate that the county has an ability to collect a surety on it. But it does turn into a weird situation where now the county is looking to access private property to do the work. If we don't have an easement, if they don't grant us an easement, that's the legal, you own the right of way. So you're not really, so we can certainly pitch this to the SA to get their opinion on it, but that's the problem with any kind of bond or surety, is you're gonna be running into those issues. And then there's probably a whole slew of insurance-related stuff and agreements that need to happen, and at any point, if they fall through or whatever it might be, then. But yeah, again, hitting the financial pocket, that usually will make people listen, right? So.
Just to clarify, this also, since it's in the SMO, this would apply to municipalities. And so that adds another layer of complication as far as property ownership.
It would.
I don't have any real clue how that would work, but that seems to be another thing that we would need to think about, is how this would be applied on a municipal level, not just the county level.
The DECI program was basically kind of derived to mirror what's already in the IEPA ILR 10 construction permit. So that permit already requires qualified personnel to inspect, inspections after every half inch of rain, report of the inspections. The DECI requirements are a little more explicit, about taking pictures, and I think in the WDO, there is an allowance for a different threshold. So instead of the 1 acre, if there is a high-quality aquatic resource, you can drop the acreage. I can't remember what that acreage is, but that's all. It's basically all outlined almost exactly in the IEPA requirements. So you can argue, I guess, that by creating this DECI section in your ordinance, that you're almost required to do that. I mean, under the IEPA permit.
What was the reference document?
IEPA ILR 10, and that's issued for construction
Over an acre.
over an acre.
The ordinance does indicate that you need a qualified inspector, but it just doesn't provide some of those details that
Okay,
the
right.
DECI program does. So that is the idea. I do want to establish that, but we backed off from the idea of having our own run program. We prefer the idea of having it vetted, starting our own list, it sounds like. And with that, potentially adding in a section that is related to the qualified inspector and really outlining some of their responsibilities. And then if they're not followed, that enforcement could come from that potentially. So that the other program is, I also don't, or that I was thinking about, is I also don't necessarily want to take it out on a DECI that's potentially doing their job but can't force the contractor to act on their duties.
Right.
So I'm punishing someone for doing their job, but.
Well, I don't think you'd be punishing them if they're reporting the violation, they call it a violation, they provide it to you, and they can't get their client or contractor to act. That's not an issue with the DECI.
It's an issue with the
The contractor, but at least the DECI is the one saying this is a violation.
Yeah.
Right, so I think that's what you really need.
And that's, all of this stuff currently, although it says you need a qualified inspector, to your point, Michael, it isn't covered to this level of detail.
Yeah, it's probably missing some of those fine details.
Right. So that person, although he's doing the reports, I do want to give them that ability that, hey, they're doing their job. This isn't a DECI problem. This is a contractor being able to properly maintain their features, whatever it is that they're doing. So maybe that's where, again, the stop work order comes in. So
So if the DECI calls it a violation, or whatever we're calling the certified erosion control inspector calls it a violation, will that allow you to do the $750 a day for your enforcement?
I don't know. That might be something where, for some of those fines and enforcements, that's usually where I rely on the SA to make sure that I can make those connections. Because what's going to happen is, I can certainly send someone anything and say, hey, you need to do this or you need to do that. If they push back and don't do it, my kind of strong arm is sending them to court with the state's attorney. And we've seen too many experiences where we felt like we've got enough and people go to trial and somehow they get off. So I just want to put it in here in a way that gives us the ability so that it's clearer, it's better well defined, and I'm sure there's going to be the cases where people slip out. Inevitably, they're going to find a way. But that we catch the majority, and the stop work order is not something that necessarily is defined in the SMO currently. So, you know, the violation aspect is with the $75, but then I would be coming up against the, you know, trying to define these outside of the performance standards, where someone can start to argue against it, tie it up in court, et cetera. So if it's clear that, hey, this the DECI, the certified inspector, is now flagging a violation because of this performance standard, and it's in there that can be, you know, the enforcement officer has the ability to issue a stop work order, that would probably be the type of, you know, language that we need in there. So they can try to fight it at that point, but it's pretty clear. Yeah.
So I have a question. If you're talking about people fighting it in court and tying it up, I mean, if their DECI has said there's a violation, you could potentially have a stop work order on the site this whole time. And to Mike's point, that's probably one of the most effective things that you can do. And so let them tie it up all they want. Their site's, you know, shut down for 3, 6, 9 months.
Which I think would be, again, more effective than trying to use, you know, this section in here. And that's really what I was hoping to kind of get out of this group. But
And I think it's been alluded to, but coming from the perspective of the contractor or the DECI, if you have clearly defined you know, ramifications, you know, it's easy to convey that to your client. The client wants to know, what do I need to do? Not what should I do? And so by having clear language, that actually then empowers the DECI or the inspector to say this is what we need to do. And so I do think having strong language and strong consequences for inaction empowers the soil erosion setup and controls inspector to influence their client. Without that, you're really putting that DECI in a very tough place. And when soil erosion sediment control requirements started coming on board, I mean, that was a very tough place to be, is being that inspector and having to tell your client, you know, this is what you're supposed to be doing. So without that language backing them up, you're really putting that person in a tough spot and creating a system that is not supporting itself. If you have that strong language, and that's actually why I really liked Lake County, is everything was very clearly spelled out, and then you can convey that to the client very clearly. So I do think that there's a lot of value there to creating a system that runs itself, as opposed to putting it on staff to have to chase after everybody. And I think that's the whole reason why we were pursuing the DECI, is actually to create that type of a system, so it does free up our staff to do other things.
If you, so one of the most effective parts of the DECI system was having that pre-construction meeting where the DECI was part of that meeting, you know, and so it's outlined from the very start, you know, what measures are in place, but that pre-construction meeting kind of set the stage for, you know, kind of a smooth operation. But that's all outlined, you know, in the language in the ordinance, that they have to have that pre-construction meeting. The other comment, I guess, on all those requirements or these certifications is all of those certifications are allowed or specified in becoming a DECI. So any of those would qualify you to become a DECI. And there's another one that's called out in the EPA permit. It's a certified stormwater inspector, so a CSI.
Okay, I think I saw that one. I came across
Yeah,
that one
and a professional engineer too. is in there.
Yeah, and not a necessarily extensive list, and we can drill down on those requirements, and I can pull from the decky length. I didn't like all of these here too. They have a lot of that criteria. I just didn't necessarily want to spend the time to come up with a list for you guys, because I wasn't sure if, you know, like you mentioned, I thought we were developing our own program. We pivoted on you a little bit, so I didn't want to get too far along without getting buy-in from the group before moving forward and putting a
Sure.
list together.
Yeah, but my comment, I guess, is just any of those certifications allow you to apply to become a DECI and would give you the credentials to become a DECI. So I guess you don't if you're thinking of adopting the DECI, you don't necessarily need to list all those out because they're already
covered.
That's
Okay.
right. They're already.
Well, just if someone though has like the CPESC but isn't a DECI, doesn't go through the DECI certification, they only hold, you know, one of these other ones. So they have the ability to become the DECI. They have not pulled that trigger for whatever reason. I don't necessarily want to list that they need to be a DECI. I get that DECI covers all of that, but I want to list that you don't need the DECI. You can have any one of these standalones be enough to be put on the list, and that's probably where we use SWCD to just confirm if there's a random, you know, like I pulled these random ones. Google searched, went to like page 10 or whatever, and like EnviroCert was a company that I saw that, you know, they looked legit type of thing. But, you know, someone that goes through that program, or maybe the person is a contractor that is, you know, west side of the county, Winnebago or something, and finds himself in a project, and then they're looking at this and saying, you know what, I'm not gonna go become a DECI, but these guys over here, they offer a nice program, maybe we should get someone trained and certified. And so it kind of opens the door for them too, if they wanna have staff that they don't necessarily need to target the DECI, which I guess is kind of our gold standard around here, if you will. That maybe they can use one of these other ones, but they need to bring it forward and indicate kind of what certification they're trying to bring forward for us to confirm that they can then go on the list.
So in your ordinance language, then would you refer to soil water conservation district like list or something, or?
No, so with the wetland certifications, it just says you need to provide, you know, evidence of school or certificate, or that you're certified in Lake County. So it would be a similar type of list of criteria. So we can say certification in Lake County's DECI program, just some of the maybe bigger ones, but then also indicate like, you know, a program that also gives you an opportunity to have experience and kind of check off all the boxes that you normally would, so that they can submit that information. So it would be housed through us, through the county, but then we would use, you know, we would have an agreement with SWCD, just like we do now for inspections, to be able to look at those requirements. So they do our wetland stuff, all our wetland stuff, you know, has no real mention of SWCD, but we contract with them, so it would just be, it would just be like, okay, can you guys take on this extra piece? And that would be something that, you know, we coordinate with them. But in kind of preliminary discussions, they're on board with this. I mean, one of Ryan's, you know, things is he always had issue with erosion control, always wanted to see something a little bit more in the ordinance. And so if no one has anything else, I'll just summarize some of the points to get this kind of into a working draft or onto the next step. So I have outlined the certifications that would be reviewed to basically be put on a list. Once you're on that list, basically you would meet the qualifications of a certified inspector, which would then, you know, some of this is already outlined in here, but have an ability to give that person a way to flag violations or notify the enforcement officer of a violation so that the enforcement officer can then issue a stop work order if needed. And have a required pre-construction meeting on top of that. And I think we settled on the idea of keep it at an acre threshold and then check to see if it's going to be an impact to any kind of high quality aquatic resource was kind of the takeaway. All right.
One last thought, and we discussed this a little bit, but I think it might need to actually have some reference in the document. So if we're saying that, 3 strikes are out or some type of penalty, I think we need to have at least a statement in there saying that if you don't comply with professional best practices or something along those lines, then your certification can be revoked. But I do think having a list, once again, looking at it from a systems standpoint, having a list is what drives a lot of consultants to actually get that certification so that they can work within the county. And then that raises the bar as well as far as having qualified people to work in the county. Because when you do create a new ordinance, one of the challenges you face is all the contractors in the area may not have the skill set to meet all those standards. So by having this type of program where you actually have a list that people are getting on, that derives demand for that type of training and brings the qualified staff that are available to work in the county up. And so it's a self-supporting system once again.
All right, with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the next agenda item. Scroll back up. 5.2, rental volume reduction and water quality changes to SMO. We're hoping to have the MS4 changes at this point. We don't. So a lot of what we put together were based on some of our findings. So I put some examples in here and just discussions with Lake County. So I do want to just, before we get into this, one of the things we talked about last time was trying to develop some goals or some targets. The difficulty with that, or just trying to get through that stormwater committee board or the commission, would be that every site obviously has its own characteristics and every site can do the best to its capabilities. So trying to have a certain target of a concentration or whatever, it might be a percentage or a value, probably a non-factor unless the IEPA comes out in their MS4 and says, you need to target this. So just as a preface to that, the other thing that we took away was the volume reduction, water quality. They're very linked. And one of the things that we were thinking about is instead of having volume reduction, water quality, those are really associated a lot of times with post-construction kind of criteria, if you will. So we were thinking of kind of bringing it into a new section, kind of post-construction BMPs or something along that line. Kind of stole that from DuPage actually. So I'll get into it. I'll go through everything again and then I'll just open it up for discussion. And again, since we don't have a lot of the MS4 changes, some of this might change, but we can still kind of discuss where kind of the feeling of the group is and if we're on the right track or maybe we need to back up and do some more research or think about certain situations. So.
And just to clarify, it's our understanding that the MS4 permit is on the desk to be signed, and we're expecting that to be released this week. Post-construction BMPs are already a requirement of the MS4, but we are expecting the MS4 to be released this week.
And Scott, if it's released this week, they go into effect this cycle or the following cycle?
The following cycle.
So they'd start March of 2025.
That's my understanding, is that we would have 12 months to get up to speed. I don't know, does anybody have any other perception of that?
I think you have to file, each community has to file a new notice of intent.
Right.
And then so that takes a process and then they would probably have, like you said, a year or so to get up to speed.
My discussions with them is that, we don't have the budget built in for that level of implementation yet. And so that would have to come through the next budget cycle. And so it was my understanding we had 12 months to get up to speed.
And does county have to also file an NOI?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so that would then have to also be approved all the way up the chain. Got it, okay, thank you.
So we did an NOI though 2 years ago. They required everybody to do one even before we saw this permit.
Right.
So doesn't that cover this, or are they gonna make us do another one?
We'll have to do another one.
Well, we're hoping to get more clarity, obviously. But we do want to kind of get our foundation here and just not, when these come out, be ready to pivot or move forward as needed. So a lot of what we're going to discuss here, actually, and I have the examples, it's already in place in pretty much every other county that you would look at in terms of like Lake County, the Collier County area. So again, just similar structure goal, capture runoff from impervious surfaces and encourage groundwater recharge and improve water quality. We do want to have some kind of quantitative measure of capturing a certain volume. We're running with a 1/2 inch per rain across new impervious area. The other ordinances, the other counties do it a little bit differently. We can get into that, why we chose 1/2 inch, that's just the 1/2 inch with the soil erosion control, there's continuity there. So, and we would also then tie this back into the MS4 program again and have that easy transition. So these examples here, probably the engineers are familiar with this. I'll run through this real quick. Lake County, they have a runoff volume reduction quantitative standard that they've developed. They have their own credit system that relies on capturing specific volumes based on the type of credit, which means based on the type of infrastructure. And depending on the infrastructure, they require you to look at a specific rain event and really strategies that minimize stormwater runoff volumes and address water quality impairments. King County, similar idea. They do a 1 inch rainfall over a new impervious area. But they kind of deviate. They require for any development that creates greater than 5,000 square feet of new impervious needs a BMP measure. So that goes down to the level of residential. Development that creates less than 5,000 square feet are subject to the discretion of the administrator. So that's tying back into that ability that we were kind of discussing earlier about vicinity to aquatic resources, along the same lines here for the BMP. DuPage County, as I mentioned, post-construction best management practices. Again, a net new impervious area. In this case, they go with 2,500 square feet. They go with 1.25 inches of rainfall, and applicants are required to identify the pollutants of concern. So I listed some of these that they have in theirs: total suspended solids, metals and oils, and nutrients consisting of nitrogen and phosphorus. So one of the things that I do want to preface with this is that a lot of the way that this ordinance, the SMO, is written for volume reduction, it's not triggered unless you're over an acre of the disturbance. And not that necessarily that triggers detention, but most of your major developments, as you guys will know, are probably going to trigger detention. So capturing that 1/2 inch of rainfall, you kind of already have a vehicle for it. And really, Lake County doesn't say any requirements if you're not over that acre. I think they do have like an impervious threshold. I'll have to check that. But Kane County and DuPage County, they deviate and they say, no, we're going at 5,000 and 2,500. So just giving you a flavor of kind of the spectrum of what has been. Go ahead. You want to provide more insight?
Well, no, I was just going to say, having dealt with those ordinances, especially the DuPage County one, where you're looking at providing PCBMPs on single-family homes, it is a total nightmare. And I would strongly urge folks to consider not going down to that level, because it's painful for the property owners, for the developers, and it's really painful for the enforcement officers. you see a lot of failed systems there and ones that are difficult to keep track of. So that's my 2 cents on this.
I'm glad you said it. I think it was gonna come out at some point anyway. So, what we did was, again, applicability, this would apply to projects that trigger storm water permitting. And so we're not necessarily throwing any thresholds out there just yet, and I'll kind of go through that. But really, we want the requirements to be based on the type of activity associated with pollutants of concern. So total suspended solids, metals and oils, nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, those are kind of the big ones. Again, we can update that list, or it can always be modified. So for some of the most common permit triggers, I just list this out here. You're looking at hydraulic disturbance of greater than 5,000 square feet, flood hazard area development, wetland area. Some of the ones I don't list, if you're part of a overall stormwater permit, if you're changing the conditions, some of those kind of common themes would also kick in. So what we're trying to do is make it more about what's going on at the property, more so than what, the size of the project or anything related to that. So some of the activities that we outlined are vehicle traffic, so commercial, industrial, those type of components where you're going to be creating a lot of hydrocarbons and oils and all that stuff. Outdoor storage, landscaping, one of the things that I always see on a plan is the landscaper's yard that's right next to, or their holding area that's right next to the detention basin. And I always make the comment, how's your stuff staying in those bins? Or you have the DOT facility that has the salt out there, all right, how is that salt, So that's the idea there. You could also have fuel, dump sites, salt storage, we talked about that. Agriculture, so is there anything related to the type of fertilizer that you're using? Are you some kind of farm that's going to be housing it in large tanks potentially? Is there anything related to animals? So something that large farms can do is create giant pits for manure storage. Now, some of this is going to be covered in IEPA because there are standards to it, but again, just throwing that out here to get the juices flowing for everybody. Maintenance facilities, vehicle repair, washing of vehicles, gas fueling tank stations, etc. So those are some of the things we're looking at as kind of an activity that might be potential for some of these pollutants to be an issue. So the other thing was just real quick, types of BMPs associated with pollutant removal. I just try to categorize it. A lot of you guys are familiar with this, and the lists kind of repeat themselves from any type of vegetation, swales, channels, strips, infiltration with pre-treatment, which would include sedimentation basins, your detention basin, your bioretention areas. For some of your oils, you have the hydrodynamic separation devices, and I'm sure that there's, probably can go on with all these different tools and components and whatnot. So one of the things that we came across that we liked was for agricultural land, if they're already maintaining agricultural best management practices in accordance with the NRCS guidelines, then I don't really see a reason why they would have to potentially comply with anything unless it was, well, normally we didn't store fertilizer, now we're storing fertilizer, the BMP that we had really wouldn't contain a spill like that. There's consideration of location and potential drain tiles and all of that, but as long as they're meeting those standards, those are not new rules, then we feel that those shouldn't be looked at in the same light. And then lastly, the long-term maintenance. Darren, alluded to, we go after these smaller owners, who's maintaining it, how are they maintaining it? Part of what we're looking at is to just in a broader scope of something that we're dealing with on the side is we're looking at potentially for maintenance to have the owner indicate that they're looking at, let's say, a rain garden or bioretention area, and that on a yearly basis or bi-yearly basis, they would just have to submit the information to show that it's still there. They haven't removed it or something along those lines as part of the agreement for them meeting that post-construction BMP. So that's kind of the gist of what we have here. So we didn't really, again, we deviated from the idea of throwing out any thresholds. We'd like to keep it geared more towards this activity idea and trying to define those a little bit more. Not to say that we shouldn't say, that below a major development to anything less than an acre, we don't look at it with the scrutiny, but maybe if, again, we have those sensitive aquatic areas, if it's in a sensitive recharge area where we expect good infiltration, to kind of spell this out. So it's a little bit of MS4 and it's a little bit revamping the current ordinance in terms of how it's written between a water reduction and water quality component. We'd like to just mimic DuPage a little bit and just call it a post-construction BMP section. So with that, I don't know who wants to go first and jump into the discussion about this, or we can start anywhere, so whatever jumps out at anyone. Or if...
How common, sorry, can we just yell out?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Michael.
So,
Vice Chair.
how common is it for a farmer to use the NRCS conservation guidelines on their site? So, does everybody do that, or is it 10% of the farms, or what?
I guess it would depend on what type of farm are you talking about? So is something like a confinement or dairy or hog facility? Hogs are more confined. A dairy facility would have like a big lagoon, like I mentioned. There's a few in our county. Jim has had one with the issue down there in his area. Yeah. Most of them in our area are smaller, but when you step across the state line, they get very large, just to the north of us. So.
I think part of the reason for referencing the NRCS is, what we've talked about is being able to provide greater flexibility for the different types of land uses in the county. And so instead of having to reinvent new BMPs, the NRCS has BMPs that are well established and have clear instructions for implementation. So that's part of the reason for looking at the NRCS BMPs as a way of providing greater flexibility.
So if you have cows, dairy farm, you have to have so many acres per cow. I think it's about an acre per cow I think you are required to have, then to spread that manure out on.
So in that case, if that dairy farmer is saying, well, I'm meeting all of these standards and that would be fine, then you don't need to go in and do a vegetative buffer strip, let's say. That's where we're trying to provide that flexibility. And the list that we have, it's not the end all be all. What I'd like to do is obviously make it open for the design engineer to say, well, I'd like to propose this, and so that way we're not excluding anything, we're open to the idea, but the idea would be to try to provide some type of long-term feature that would provide a benefit that identifies that, hey, we've got to deal with this manure properly. We've got, we've had in the news lately, what do we have, commercial truck stop that's been a big, in one of the municipalities, it's been a big point of contention that you're gonna have all these vehicles that now are gonna be producing, they're gonna be dripping and they're gonna be doing all this stuff, and they're potentially adjacent to the Kishwaukee or the Nippersink or whatever, or next to a farmland, or some of these go on former farmland and there's drain tiles, and I know that sometimes they're not all flowing, but you have a blowout, that thing opens up again, now you're moving pollutants through large portions of the county. So that's why we kind of decided to look at what's the activity happening there, and does it really justify to have a B&P? So as Darren mentioned, if a person is on a bigger subdivision lot and they're just looking to do a garage in the back and their subdivision plan allows them for the extra impervious and it's all draining to a detention basin and they're over the 2,500 square foot number, does that really justify for them to have a B&P with the type of activity? You know, what are they potentially doing? And if they're doing some kind of inside garage repair or something like that, that's usually gonna come out in the building code, where you need the floor drains and the special holding tank and all of that stuff. But sometimes the issue might be where, not just on farmland, but people try to claim ag exemption any way that they can. And so when they do that, then that building, it doesn't go through that building review where you need those floor drains and they're potentially changing, you know, Scott gave the example of changing their oil and whatnot. And so that's why we try to tailor it towards more of an activity, have that half-inch of rainfall. That seems like that would be enough for impervious areas where you're flushing everything out. Now, if the consensus is we want to bump it up to an inch, you know, that's open for discussion. But that's really the idea behind here, that, you know, even a farmer that's building a pole barn, is he gonna have vehicle traffic? Yes, but is it to the amount that it's to the point where you can say that it's gonna be like a truck stop? No. So it's just giving an ability, and I think this would be helpful for us because from an MS4 perspective, no matter what happens, we would potentially be, you know, covered to kind of handle a whole slew of different components.
And you would, I mean, just as you gave this discussion, it would still be a best judgment as someone would come into the counter and present, like a pole barn versus a commercial truck stop. You're going to still use best judgment at the counter.
100%.
Okay.
But we, obviously, I don't want to leave it, we get into these and define them a little bit more, you know,
Understood.
maybe it's greater than 50 parking stalls, or, you know, having some justifications in there.
And I was just gonna follow up on that. I get a little bit nervous tying the requirement for this practice to the type of activity, because they can be a little bit gray, and from both sides of it. If I'm the engineer representing the developer, I would like a really clear knowledge of when this would be required, and a square feet of impervious area does that for me. So I know exactly, if I'm over 20,000 square feet, I know I'm providing detention, and to your point earlier, if you're providing detention, that provides you a great vehicle to also provide water quality treatment and infiltration. Now, if I'm working for a developer and he doesn't really know exactly what he's gonna use this for, maybe he's got a purpose outlined, but maybe he wants to, you know, it's gonna change, or maybe it doesn't fit neatly into these, it just opens it up to so much interpretation that it's difficult on your end to implement it, it's difficult on the end of every enforcement officer in the county to implement, but it's also difficult for the engineer and then the property owner and the developer, because there is this gray area. I really I love the half inch. I love tying it to a certain amount of new impervious area that hopefully is consistent with when larger amounts of stormwater management would be required, such as stormwater detention.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I would just say that, you know, enforcing, so on one end, you've got the small impact enforcement, which is, I agree with Darren, it's difficult, but I would also say that you kind of want to, I would recommend to veer away from trying to enforce ag, you know, activity. So if it's not, you have an exemption here, which sounds good, but maybe you want to look at increasing, if you're going to leave ag activity, it says it's triggered, would be triggered to stormwater permitting. So I don't know how much, you know, I don't think you want to get into the business of like permitting, you know, just like, you know, row crop production and stuff like that. So any other exemptions that you can think of that, you know, I think trying to permit farmers or regulate farmers, I think I would recommend to stay away from that.
So we're not necessarily permitting, like, so it would be, do you want to say something, Bruce?
Yeah, on the fertilizer part of it, I just looked it up on the Illinois Department of Ag website. 2002, they amended that. So anybody that stores any chemicals or fertilizers on their property, as long as it's not over 45 days, they don't have to have secondary containment.
Okay.
So that's like buying it in
What was
season.
that part about secondary containment? Because that's actually was part of what we were
If you
discussing.
store it over 45 days, you have to have secondary containment.
Okay,
Most of us get it in season, we get it and we apply it right away. And then there's thresholds, there's 300 gallons of bulk pesticides, 300 pounds dry pesticides, 5,000 gallons of liquid fertilizer, or 50,000 pounds of bulk dry fertilizer. That falls under the Department of Ag for the secondary containment rules. And that's for a non-commercial farmer. There's some others that are going into business that are commercial, they should, that doesn't fall under them. And the other thing, as a farmer, we have to follow a nutrient management plan for what we have on our field. And actually now through the FSA office, there's money for us to follow those nutrient management plans. So we're not over applying our pesticides or chemicals, fertilizers.
could you email Stoyan a link to that document?
Sure.
That'd be helpful. And the other question, since we're talking about this, is cover. So like one of the concerns would be, if you do have like a chemical mixing station or a fueling station, having some type of cover. Because what we're looking to do with any type of industrial development or anything else is preventing contact of rainfall with the potential pollutant source. So are there any requirements for having cover?
Not right now. The only thing I'd be concerned about is the insurance company with the fire department. If you're containing vapors underneath that cover, you're gonna create a fire hazard.
Well, a gas station has a canopy
Yeah.
specifically to prevent that type of regular contact. So not in an enclosed space per se, but some type of cover.
No, my
But I
tank-
just was curious, the secondary containment, I'm thrilled to hear that that's being addressed.
Yeah. Now, my tanks on my farm are all double wall tanks. So I've actually got a tank within a tank, just for that reason.
Still gonna have to.
Okay.
But if you're doing chemicals and mixing in the field, you don't need to do that. But if it's on farm, they don't have any regulations for that yet. If it's commercial, yes, like all conserve facilities, all mixing pads and indoor and have your triple.
Well, that's a good distinction to
Containment.
know about too, so thanks for that.
But
input.
that's all regulated by Department of Ag.
Okay.
So I do want to touch on the idea that we're not, for the permitting, where this would come up is if the ag farmer is potentially expanding their impervious area and doing a new pole barn.
Right.
Recent example is agritourism. So if they're doing agritourism, but, and Mike, to your point, I think they have cows out there and they've already gone through the idea of having the holding tank and all that stuff. Now when you trigger that 1 acre component or requirement, now you're triggering BMPs. And so if you don't have some kind of reference to the activity or like listing the type of pollutant necessarily, then what is the, my only, and I agree with you, Darren, I want to provide engineers an ability to cross their T's and dot their I's. But then, that doesn't seem like an opportunity where we would really need a BMP necessarily because, again, a lot of that is probably drain off from the roof. It's for the cows to move around, so you're not really talking about like heavy metals and oils. A lot of it's contained indoors. The operation is contained indoors. You have all the holding facilities, et cetera. So we're not trying to regulate the ag community. It's just when they trigger a stormwater permit like that where they're trying to do a new barn or a new facility. We just want to ask the question, what is the facility being used for? And those type of criteria, instead of saying you're over an acre, you got to give me a BMP. And then the idea becomes, well, what type of BMP am I going to need? Because that's all it ties back to. So we can tell you that, yeah, over 5,000 square feet, you need a BMP, but how do you determine what that BMP is without really having a way to at least on some initial level indicate what your operation is, so we know, are we handling metals and oils, are we handling nutrients and things like that. And that was part of the example for DuPage, where they ask for that information for you to identify pollutants of concern. If 10 years down the road, they retrofit, things change, and they don't necessarily treat the stormwater permit, that's a point of discussion where, you know, that could be a potential issue. But, you know, I don't know how we would necessarily handle, because anyone can go through that process. But that's my only thing that I know the engineers are looking at me like, hey, what's this activity thing? But we need to have some kind of way to be able to identify what type of BMP should be used. Go ahead.
I keep raising my hand, I don't know if that's the right way to do it.
That's fine.
I mean, I like the way DuPage County does that part of it. I mean, I hate their low threshold.
Sure.
But I think the way they make you go through once you trip the threshold and determine what are your pollutants of concern and defining a BMP to treat those, that's all great logic. I just think that having this infiltration practice or volume control or whatever we're going to call it, it's a significant design issue for a project. And so to be able to identify when that's triggered, similar to stormwater detention, very early in the process is extremely helpful for, I think, for everybody, which is why I like tying it to a number, but then how you do it, I think, can get tied to the type of activity.
So out of curiosity, have you done much work, has anybody done a lot of work in Kane County in regard to their standards? You know, if you're over a threshold, you need to do a BMP, and so that would include residential. So I'm just kind of curious, the difficulty of implementing that in Kane County versus DuPage County. I didn't have any experience with that myself, but I have done a lot of work in DuPage County, and I know how complicated that can be. But specific to comparing DuPage to Kane County, if anybody has experience with that.
I've just had experience in both with residential BMPs and have had a tremendous amount of difficulties. When the BMP is on a residential lot, it makes it very, very difficult to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do, making sure it's getting maintained, and making sure that 5 years down the road, it's actually still there when the property is sold, and then the person who's just bought that property knows what it is and why it's there and that it needs to stay. And if you're managing 20 homes, it's not that big of a deal, but when you've got like thousands of residential homes, it makes it very cumbersome to do this on a lot basis.
But and that's why I think if you know, most of those probably are less than 5,000 square feet, so they wouldn't even trigger a permit. But then a lot of those would probably be excluded, because if we put in there that, you know, they're building a garage for just to store their, I don't know, a collection of cars, and they're not indicating that it's going to be any kind of repair or service area, then the potential pollutant source is none there. And so it would be up to that person to kind of give that information. And if their business, if they sell the business later and it changes and, you know, the way that we permitted it and thought about that BMP is no longer valid, I mean, there's really nothing we can do about that. What our thought process was is to use that idea and just ask for some kind of justification of potentially why BMP would not be needed. And we can have some criteria for that to help, you know, provide it straightforward. So for like ag, potentially I'm meeting these in our NRCS standards for residential. It's just a garage. I don't have any, you know, whatever it might be, would. Now, if everybody still would prefer a firm number, then I guess we can move towards a discussion of what that number would be. Otherwise, it would just be some kind of indication And maybe if it's less than 10,000 square feet, you don't have to provide that justification. But you could have an old industrial facility that's doing a 10,000 square foot parking lot expansion. And maybe they are a source of a lot of pollutants, and it makes sense to try to catch them. So that's where I would offer that. I know it's gonna be a little unclear for engineers maybe, and maybe we can define that a little bit. And also give an opportunity to any homeowner to come in and say, well, I'm just doing a garage, and it's gonna be my normal 2 cars that I have out there. I'm not looking to have a business or anything like that tied to it that could potentially be a bigger source for one of these pollutants.
So I agree, like I understand about the whole trigger and, square footage and all that, but my challenge is always the small service stations, like the non-big players, right? Or the expansions for landscaping materials or outdoor storage. Those are the ones that need the BMPs the most and are causing the most problems. And I don't necessarily have a mechanism besides the EPA industrial or commercial to go after them.
That's why I put landscaping in here, because we do have a lot of that. And I don't, some of the material that they're bringing in, it's not covered. I don't know where they're getting it from. It could be contaminated, and it's just free to flow wherever. So that is the perfect example for why potentially, and it might not be, it might just be a 2,000 square foot area that they pile yay high of whatever it happens to be. So that's where, again, I'd rather try to find a way to gear it towards identifying the pollutant and putting some requirements there or some criteria there. Whereas it sounds like the ag community, again, not really too worried there, but to Bruce's point, like Bruce, if you were, let's say, proposing new holding tanks or something like that, obviously at that point, we would be asking the question, doesn't this need some kind of like USDA or IEPA or some of those smaller fueling stations have to go through some of that criteria? So they might already be meeting it. And maybe their justification is, well, I gotta meet USDA standards and, here's my approval from them, or here's my, whatever it might be, to show that whatever that holding tank has, that potentially, it's got enough of that control on it so that we can avoid any potential spills or whatever it might be. And DOT especially, I'm sure you have some examples.
Oh, we have, the amount of things we have to do is earth shattering, but that's another, the only thing, since landscaping was brought up, and I know they're all over the place, that will also be viewed either as shade tree operation has to be brought into compliance because they're turned in, or because a group comes in legitimately and says, hey, we want to. Obviously, it would also be reviewed by P&D in general. So it would be reviewed by your division of P&D also, right? I mean,
For just a landscaping business that
yeah.
comes in?
Let's say someone wants to do one, so they say, okay, I want a conditional use, or I want a variance,
Yeah,
or I want a zoning, or whatever. I mean, any of the ways they do, you'd review it at that time as well.
Through the conditional use, yes. Most of these landscaping businesses have to go through the conditional use processes because the properties that they're on are not zoned for that.
Exactly. So,
However, so I would give feedback to that development. And most of the time, from a stormwater perspective, I'm not saying yes or no to the zoning change, because really that's what it is, it's a zoning change. I'm more prepping them for, by the way, this is what you're gonna face during stormwater permitting. So even though you get your zoning change, be aware you might not get your stormwater permit to do what you want. So you just spend a bunch of money going through this process. You gotta make sure that you understand the next step involved. And I certainly try to, use that as an opportunity to just kind of say, here's what I'm seeing. Just, it could be a recommendation. You might want to look at this sooner rather than later. But at no point also would I expect them to potentially have a developed pollutant list or anything along those lines, because they potentially have to spend the money to get that information or design that plan. I don't want them spending money if they're just gonna get denied the zoning change and can't do their business. So, yeah, it's kind of like a chicken or the egg thing, where I gotta be careful to not ask for too much, but just enough to make it reasonable, type of thing, so.
Sorry, a couple other questions. So if there was like a 50-acre subdivision that came in, based on the list here, they would not, you're thinking that you would not want them to provide the volume control?
Well, I think with, again, that's where we could potentially, on this, indicate that you're a subdivision now, you're gonna have however many homes, which would be equivalent to the vehicle traffic, to, whatever it might be. So I would say yes, but to your point, a lot of the section right now within the SMO for volume reduction only covers 1 acre developments. It doesn't cover anything else. So when I was reading this, I was like, if 1 acre developments, most of the time they're triggering detention, sure, there's a small percentage, but if I'm triggering that, I'm already providing this, volume reduction because I have to provide detention. So why even have, it just was kind of like this weird idea of, why am I gonna tell someone to hold back an inch of water if they're already doing it through their detention basin? Detention's not infiltrating any water.
Yeah, that's
Right,
what I was
so
thinking.
it ties into the water quality component, but then this would only apply to 1 acre developments where a lot of the time you're probably getting most of that already covered through a lot of your other stormwater provisions. So, and that's why I did volume reduction / water quality, because to me, like you said, I thought water quality was more, volume reduction would be more tied to water quality, which would be more tied to post-construction BMPs. So why not just have one section that really outlines it better, clear what's the goal, what's the purpose, instead of having these two sections that are related but are independent, I guess.
And this also then helps, so this stands as a qualifying program for MS4 permits. So municipalities then would be able to take credit for this as part of their MS4 permit. The SMO already stands as the qualifying program for the municipalities to meet the minimum control standard for construction runoff control, as well as post-construction. But that post-construction is really kind of a ambiguous element. And so this is providing increased clarification and strengthening that qualifying program for municipalities' MS4 programs.
But that would be for, and maybe they all are, that would be for certified communities. The non-certified communities fall under you.
But we wouldn't be the caretaker of their MS4 system, just like non-certified communities in the NFIP, we're not the caretaker of their floodplain.
Okay.
So, and one of the points that we discussed last time was trying to stay away from municipalities and dictating like how much impervious area they can or whatever. So we took that under notion too, to your point, Jody, now you as an enforcement officer can ask for some of these things and have an ability to make that determination. One of the, I can't remember if it's Kane or DePage, has a specific component, like if you know that if this is an area where we know it floods, guess what? You're putting in flood control. So if we know an area that this is sensitive and you're gonna be potentially bringing in sources of pollution, then we wanna give those tools and to be applied properly and not hamper someone down to then come back and say, okay, well, here's how I plan on taking care of this. And really it just becomes more of a dialogue and a narrative, almost like the SWIP. In the SWIP, you have to, if you're storing chemicals or things like that, you have to define how you're taking care of some of these things. So really, this is just a continuation of the SWIP into post-construction instead of just keeping it in that construction site phase or development site phase. And we feel that in this way, people would also be proposing BMPs when necessary, that we can have them document it, and they come up with a maintenance plan, and then, again, as long as they're demonstrating that they're following through and maintaining it, then they are complying with their permitting as a way of asset management. And we certainly don't want to require it on every single residential lot, as Darren mentioned. But that's why I threw the, DuPage, Kane County requirements for those BMPs, because I know that is a struggle. But I don't want to get to that level, but I want to have enough there where we can identify something that could be critical. That's the main goal again, so.
In terms of quantitative measurements, is that going to be defined by the EPA? Like, are they going to, as a part of this MS4 permit, say that there has to be a certain percentage removal or a standard, or are we just going to kind of wait to fill that in depending upon what their permit says?
So in conversations with Lake County, if IEPA comes out and says you need to hit 80% total suspended solid removal, then we would have to try to incorporate that. And since this kind of foundational piece identifies total suspended solids as already a potential impact, and we can define some BMPs, we can further clarify that if you fall under this idea that you're going to be creating, and I threw TSS in here, but TSS is probably mostly during the construction site. Like after everything's stabilized, we're probably not worried about that, so maybe not a good example, but if they don't do that, then we're probably not going to get anything passed, even if as a group we want to hit 80% or whatever it is, because it's always going to come back to, well, this is the best that I can do. This is the best to the practical capabilities that I can do it. And so it makes it hard to say, no, you can't do 79%. You have to do 80%. And that was something that was given to us as guidance from Kurt at Lake County. If they don't specify it, don't even attempt it to go to a specific number. So instead it was, okay, well, we know that we have a lot of vehicle traffic, so engineer, here's some of the available BMPs as an idea, not the full list. Come up with a BMP or a train, or if you're going to have infiltration, the pre-treatment, all of that stuff. And we didn't want to, a lot of this is defined in the urban manual, all these websites. Crystal Lake Watershed Development Ordinance has really good language on infiltration and pre-treatment, and the SMO already points to that. So we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, but we wanted to, the landscape example, go back to that. We wanted to have an ability to be able to have a BMP for something like that. And it doesn't, the person might say, okay, well, I'll throw a cover on it and I'll have it completely enclosed so the rain can't get to it. I mean, that potentially satisfies that, right? It's not the BMP of a vegetated swale, but they've come up with a different solution for that. And that's when, again, if we do a threshold where you have to do it for all new impervious, and again, that ½ inch, then the pollutant source is really the storage of that material. So do we really need a ½ inch over that area if it's fully enclosed? So we just wanted to work in as much flexibility as we could for each developer and treat it on a case-by-case basis and give them an opportunity to really paint the picture for us. And maybe sometimes they're not going to paint it as clear and we're going to miss stuff, and that's going to probably happen no matter what. But that's really where we were trying to go when we kind of put this together.
And then a mechanism of enforcement, because that's one of my challenges, is how do you go back and, the WDP is, it's already closed. How do you go back 10 years later and make them do it, or,
That's the million-dollar question.
That was actually something we were hoping to get from you guys. I think
You tell us.
Closing statement, what has worked elsewhere, because that is the big challenge. How are you going to, And I'll mention an event we have coming up at the end, but how do you track these types of things, and especially as you have property changes? Now, with some things, you can have an easement or, you know, have it platted and recorded so that is transferred from property owner to property owner. But to your point, how does that next property owner really understand how these things work, what type of maintenance goes into it? So that is a challenge, and so we do need to be aware of the potential unintended consequences and build in as much, methods to address that as possible and practicable.
So I've been getting a lot of pushback on requiring easements over water quality structures. They just don't want to do it. So I guess we've kind of thrown up our hands and said, fine, we'll get it in the industrial, commercial MS4 inspections for, you know, their NOI permits for, you know, for those activities. So I don't know.
Well, part of our concern was that if we, as the county, we're working on kind of a new asset management tool ourselves. But what if this particular, whoever, you know, certified community you're working for doesn't really have the tools or the infrastructure in place? We don't necessarily want to recommend, here's how we're going to track it, so you need to track it too. And that's, again, that's where Scott was asking the question, well, what's work, what's not? And is that something maybe we want to have less in here to then have the enforcement officer for the municipality figure out, does it make sense to use it as part of whatever other codes that municipality might have that the county doesn't even have? Are there other avenues to throw that in? Does the municipality maybe want to create a green infrastructure resolution, or, you know, whatever it might be, that would be better suited to their needs? So it's not going to be one size fits all type of thing, and the long-term maintenance, that one is real tricky. Very, very tricky.
If you tie this to a stormwater basin, you know, like Darren was saying, then you can have a maintenance plan as part of that ultimately, because they're required to do maintenance plans for stormwater basins.
I think this has got to be part of your stormwater infrastructure for the site, and just as any other piece of stormwater infrastructure, it's got to be in an easement. If it's not, there's just no way that I go back to the single-family home thing. You put a rain garden in the back of a single-family home. That's a weed patch to the next guy that
Yes.
owns it, and so
Yes.
he's just going to fill it in and turf it over.
Yep.
And if it's not in an easement, it's going to be gone forever.
No, 100%, and I think that's something that we've seen is the potential owner comes in, and they're like, well, we're gonna be maintaining it, and, you know, I asked them, well, what happens 20 years later? You know, yeah, you've made a dedication, but then someone else comes in and it's no longer active. So putting it on the plat and recording it would stay with the property, not necessarily with the property owner, and then there's that perpetual enforcement capabilities, which we have to figure out with that municipalities, the flexibility, and the county flexibility, so.
I apologize, I need to take off.
I see everyone mostly leaving, so maybe Darren, go ahead. Maybe what I'll do for now is, it seems like everybody likes this idea of defining the pollutants, maybe not, you know, I know you want some specific requirements, so should staff potentially go down the path of trying to provide some more criteria for the different pollutants? A breakdown, or what
I mean, I
you guys
think
feeling?
if you request something like DuPage is doing, I mean, I agree with Darren on that too. I think that it's not necessarily a bad idea to have them identify the pollutants and just put the onus on them to identify what they're treating for.
Okay.
But then tie the treatment to something larger, like a, you know, detention or something, so we don't have, you know, every little home, you know, coming in with these treatment plants or these rain gardens or whatnot, you know.
Okay.
It should probably hit the bigger ones first. And then you can see how it works out, and then in, you know, 5 or 10 years, if somebody wants to go smaller, you could always adjust the, you know, the level down. But
Okay,
I think you need to tie it to something so we know what's what's gonna be required to provide these things.
All right, so what I'll do then is I'll stay on this idea, but I'll give you guys a little bit of a better breakdown of a structure. I'll structure it, because right now I left it open-ended for the purposes of discussion. We'll throw some structure on it, have you comment, see if we need to take a step back or did we move forward in the correct way? Now we just need to maybe add a little bit more details within that structure. Would that
Yeah.
be fair?
Yes, I've seen, just another comment is MWRD recently seems to have been doing enforcement of previous detention systems that are failing. And of course, you know, they've got more resources than all the other counties combined, but I'm curious to find out, they're going to the municipalities and saying you have to take enforcement action on certain detention ponds. And they may be tying it to, you know, eligibility in some of their programs or something like that. So I'm gonna maybe
It'd be
ask.
great if you can send some information. I will, not something I was planning on bringing up, but something that we have discussed is potentially for some of this is developing a stormwater utility, where if you're gonna be doing something, you know, on the acre stage and you don't meet, you know, it's out there, it exists, but, so.
I'm sorry, I missed that, Mike, were you talking about MWD?
Yeah, so we've been starting to get contacted by like HOAs that have been notified by MWRD that they need their ponds repaired. So if they have major erosion or other structural defects, somehow they're going around and inspecting them, and it just started. So I don't know how that's happening yet, but I'm gonna inquire on it.
I imagine it's tied, so this is unpublished work, but, well, 4 to 6 months ago, we did an assessment for MWRD as part of their PARP process, that's their phosphorus assessment reduction plan. They wanted to go and unearth like their stormwater components. The stormwater, compared to what like all the collective wastewater treatment plants are pushing out, it's a small part, right? Same as the DRWW North Branch, right? But they wanted to say, hey, let's put some good faith into looking at the stormwater component of it, because we think maybe there's some avenues there and it would be a good could be good for, you know, public perception as well. And we did kind of an assessment and we threw out some ideas, and one was the dead storage, the pool space. And some of that was tied to some work that's been done in Minnesota that essentially is saying that this buildup under certain conditions, an oxic condition, that sediment, that phosphorus becomes mobilized, it turns into soluble phosphorus, becomes bioavailable, and this stuff is coming out of these ponds at very high levels. And you know, you go anywhere and you can see all these algal blooms in these ponds, and I'm not necessarily saying that's the case. But, you know, tying these things to the sale of a property, okay, before you can sell this property, you need to do an assessment of how much dead pools, you know, is it ready for dredging? Even SMC put out guidance in their HOA plan. They put out a nice 20-page document, I think, way back in 2010, Mike, you might be familiar with it, that says that homeowners should be, or people should be assessing the sediment and their dead pool volume every 5 years. Now, there's no guidance that says you have to do anything about it, but essentially what we're finding out, and there's enough breadcrumbs out there at this point, is that we're seeing a lot of sediment. A lot of the sediment in these ponds becoming a phosphorus source. It's no longer a sink. And when you think of that from the collective time of development, right, it seems we go in these development surges and we die off. How many detention ponds are in that riparian corridor? They're all sized the same way, so if they all age the same way, they're all going to start to push the sediment out at similar hydro periods, and then that's in your system, and that's a slug of phosphorus that gets pushed through your system, and it all can hit at one time. So that was something we recommended. They were going to, I think, look at it from kind of an enforcement standpoint, but they realized that even from their standpoint, they would have to take on more staff, even more, try to enforce this.
Right.
Legal support, because I think the concern is and you brought it up, is that the community is just trying to chase this down on a community level, very, very difficult. We suggested MWD basically take it over, and that's when they said, well, we can't even staff that. So it's a logistics problem for everyone.
Yeah.
One other thing, just so you're aware of something, and it's related but off base. I don't know if you're aware, but there's tax issues regarding real estate taxes on properties. You don't pay a payment, that's fine. At the end of the year, it goes up for an auction at a given percentage. If for 3 years taxes aren't paid on something, then it goes to what they call a silent auction at the end of every year in the fall. I have to go through those every year because anything that touches a right-of-way, either county or township, is supposed to alert to say, hey, you may want to try to acquire this piece for the purpose of your right-of-way or your intersection or your whatever. As I go through that whole list of all those pieces, I would be very afraid to say how many detention bases. Homeowners associations simply go, oh, I stopped paying on this for 3 years, it's no longer mine, and nobody buys them. I mean, people aren't fools, but there are so many out there. If you create this utility, I don't know if then you'd be required to take these things over, because there are a lot of properties every year they show up on that list. And all they are is the detention basin that was assigned a PIN number, and they just stopped paying taxes on it. And I've driven by some just casually as you see them and you think about them, you're like, wow, that thing's grown over. Wow, that thing's silted in. Wow, look at that. Look, all the weir has eroded away and it's really not detaining. And I'm like, when you said that, the utility, I unfortunately gasped wow, and I heard Adam laugh at me. And I'll take the laughter, but I be careful, please.
Well, the storm, I'm not sure we're talking the same thing, stormwater utility. So if you're proposing to build a 25,000 square foot house and creating X amount of new impervious, then you're paying a fee based on that new impervious.
So you're not saying taking over the existing?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, so this would be a way to try to develop, because Mike brought up programs to help pay for some of this. And certainly you could have subdivisions go defunct, they're not built out. But to Brian's point, they have a detention basin that now nobody's maintaining, the HOA's dissolved or whatever it is.
So you're looking at creating more like what the drainage districts are? A fee is charged to each property, those dollars are
It's
used.
commonly referred to as a stormwater utility, and the utility may be a bit misleading, but it's a practice that's being implemented around the country.
As I mentioned, it's something that we've talked about, we haven't vetted it or anything like that. It just seemed to be an idea, so I threw it out there just as part of the whole program idea. But just to show you that we don't really have a great answer for this right now, so.
Appreciate the clarification.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go ahead, we'll come back, we'll dive more into this, develop some more thresholds and put some structure for you guys. So I'll move on to the next agenda item. These should go relatively quickly. So the revised bulletin 75 data. Basically, Michael sent this to me, it's also available from the county, but they developed a new one based on Bulletin 75 rainfall data. They did not deviate. All they've done is change it to a runoff curve number. I don't think there's any issue to just updating the current one that we have, so I can move that over to MCSC if there's no discussion on it. No? Okay. Then the last agenda item is for something that I brought up related to TCOs, so temporary certificates of occupancy or certificates of occupancy. We talked about not proposing anything for the municipalities that would impact their ability. So all I did was in this section, we would add really one more line item that says all disturbed areas of the site shall have the final grading completed and permanently stabilized prior to the completion of any project. So it's not tied to any COs or TCOs. And then a quick definition for final grading. All proposed elevations on the permitted plans are substantially completed with no stockpiles remaining. Seed and blanket has been installed for any major/minor stormwater systems. Those are specific definitions that talk about your detention basin, your swales, etc. So if any of those are there. as applicable in areas with slopes exceeding 4 to 1. So back to kind of you mentioned steep slopes, Brian. So I don't know if anyone has any input on this. We can,
They need to have the record drawings of the final grading submitted then, so you can verify all the stormwater systems are in compliance.
you know what, that's a good point. I don't know for this. I think there's a section related to that. I'll see if that already takes care of it. Otherwise, I will, that's a good point, like any as-built, elevation certificates, et cetera.
Well, and easements would fall in that too, right, Steve?
Yeah.
Yep.
So for easements, you actually have to have those platted and recorded before you issue your permit.
Okay.
So
I think he's referring to the grading of the easement,
Well,
not the
yeah.
easement being
Oh,
recorded.
okay.
Yeah, the grading of any overflow routes, anything that you have that you need to go back and verify with your record drawings or your as-bills to make sure it's in compliance.
So tied back to the record drawing specifically.
Right.
Yeah,
A
I'll
lot
have
of
to.
times we don't get those until later in the process, and what was this necessarily tied to?
So this,
Final occupancy or something?
temporary. Yeah, a lot of, so, single-family residences, we get a lot of temporary, certificates of occupation requests that are, hey, I've got my final grading done, I just don't have it stabilized because I need my grass to grow. But the ordinance, although we give out permit conditions, and a lot of those permit conditions are pulling from the ordinance, there actually isn't anywhere in the ordinance that really said, outside of soil erosion control. So if you're doing soil erosion control, you might see like stockpile, that has to be stabilized. But again, it's in that soil erosion control performance standards. There's no real place that says, when is a project actually considered complete? And I know that should be pretty standard in terms of using a common sense point of view. But my building guys have to issue a certificate of occupancy and then, or a temporary, and they tie a lot of the requirements back to ordinances. And none of this shows up in the ordinance. And so sometimes they have a hard time doing that. And also the contractors come in and they ask, well, what do you mean, completion or finally stabilized, or what does final grading mean? And so final grading isn't necessarily defined anywhere, so this is just providing that clarity more so than anything of when like Jody can sign, or you, Steve, can sign off on a project that releases the contractor, you're good, you can sign off on it. So the as-built I will look into if we should incorporate it. Otherwise, the whole idea with the grading of the easements, that's why the final grading was worded in a way that whatever the permitted plans show are substantially completed, that would identify any areas of those plans, whether they're an easement or not. And I'll double check on the record drawings, because the record drawings usually tailored to like substantial, I forget what the word is, the plans that they show that they're done with the plans. So maybe I'll update this definition and bring it back for next time.
They're in substantial conformance.
Conformance, thank
A
you.
lot of times, but the record drawings, we need, if they're not, then we want, perhaps some calculations or something associated with them to show that the weir is at a different elevation than on the plans, if it's higher, if it's lower, what's going on there, just so that, usually in the municipal level, we tie it to the letter of credit conversion to a maintenance bond, which may not, that's typically a year or something, or whenever it is, depending on how the site's built out. We hold things for a long time just to make sure we can get our roads done.
So maybe I just need to incorporate substantial conformance to the permitted plans in this to really have it's not open-ended anymore, and substantial conformance, then you can tie it back to the as-bills, which are already covered in other parts.
Yeah.
To that end, that was if you could take in your definition.
Or I don't know, you have a lot of DOT stuff, what would you?
Well, I was gonna say, it's, if you could just add in, are substantially completed in compliance with the design drawings with no stockpiles remaining, because just to say it's completed, well, I can final grade any way I want. You gotta tie into the design plan.
I don't wanna, so I do wanna back up, I don't wanna say final grading needs substantial conformance.
Why not?
Or maybe I do, I don't
I
know.
was gonna say, why don't you? Because if it isn't substantially, I mean,
Yeah.
could there be a slight change?
You
Yes,
could have
but,
drainage going the wrong way.
yeah, you got things going backwards, it's like, well, wait a second.
No, that's true, I should go into, I was
should be
thinking of putting it in the, I'll put it in the definition.
Yes.
Instead of substantially completed in substantial conformance with the permitted plans.
Right, I mean, you have some leeway, but you don't want it flowing the wrong direction.
No, and I was just thinking in my head, so normally I wouldn't approve a TCO or CO if it didn't have aspects for stormwater management system. So, I think I'll include that in there though, because I think it's more clear, because, yeah, it's substantially completed versus substantial conformance with the plans
Okay.
are, they can be viewed as two different things, so I'll get that update in there. I'll bring that back, and we can, if everybody likes that, I'll bring it up to MCSC.
One other quick thing.
Yeah.
So in the first sentence, it says permanently stabilized, and then in your definition, it talks about seed and blanket. I always view seed and blanket as like a temporary stabilization. Is it circular, or are we giving them conflicting, like?
So, for the TCO, so it depends if they are, and I should say kind of the permanent stabilization, I do not give for seed and blanket. But I will give them a TCO because I know they've laid that down and they've seeded it, they just need that to come through. I also wouldn't give a TCO if they're like, okay, we're gonna leave this for the winter and the spring. Well, you might wanna throw some seed and blanket down because you're not gonna get that seed to stay. Or maybe it's a sloped area, or maybe it's, again, a detention basin. So I don't know if that answered what you were asking.
To Jody's point, I think you could, if you simply took out the word permanently.
Right, it could be
You'd have it, because
temporary.
it's
Okay.
stabilized, and then in your definition, you say, blanket and seed, yeah, so all you need, I think that would cover, and your point's well made.
Because permanently
Yeah,
stabilized
I mean,
to me
there's
means
grass, it's done, it's,
70%
we're
grass,
finished, yeah, exactly.
So just stabilized.
Yeah, just take the word permanently out of your first line of your,
Okay.
number 4, it should do it.
All right, so remove permanently, put in substantial conformance instead of substantial completed. And we're ready to rock and roll, okay.
I mean, I've seen a lot of sites where they just, for whatever reason, don't get their plants to grow, and it's not enough, you know, a temporary condition is one thing. So I think it's still acceptable, but, you know, if it becomes a problem, chase back after them.
And that's why the county has temporary, I don't know what municipalities do, and that's why I wanted to make sure I'm not, you know, stepping on any toes there. All right, we'll wrap up the old business items then. We don't have any new business.
I was gonna mention our, City Works, talking to her,
Let's do it at the end real quick. Let me just give a quick update on the report for the watershed planning. So we've got good direction coming from the IEPA. We're hoping to get our watershed boundaries done to then bring them here and hopefully have a little bit more detail on some of the requirements behind some of the studies to kind of start develop that, to really see the benefit of some of the SMO drivers, some of the different things we've been discussing to increase flexibility for certain areas and not have the one size solution fits all type of thing. So we're moving towards that. We're hoping to hopefully have more information for everyone next time. And on a similar note, Scott does want to just real quick give a plug.
Yeah, so I think a lot of you participated in these in the past, but for the past several years, we've been doing what we refer to as BMP talking tours. So we collaborate with the environmental defenders, and we're doing 6 programs a year right now. And so we're trying to showcase examples of best management practices being implemented in McHenry County. So our next program is going to be May 17th. So these are held on Fridays. We typically hold them from 1 to 3 on Fridays. That seems to be the best time to get municipal staff to be able to participate, because that's really our target audience for these types of programs. So this program is going to be focusing on the CityWorks Asset Management Program. And so Michelle Zimmerman and the Village of Algonquin have been using CityWorks, which is a GIS-based asset management program, to just a really incredible degree. They have improved the efficiency of their programs, which have resulted in significant cost savings. But these programs can be used for asset management like detention basins and different types of green infrastructure, MS4 stormwater improvements as far as scheduling your basin cleanouts that be the most effective for water quality. So this type of asset management program, really, it can be a profoundly powerful tool when it comes to stormwater. And so we're going to be focusing on this, and we'll meet at the Village of Algonquin's Public Works. And we were talking to Michelle Zimmerman about our watershed-based approach, and we got on the subject of CityWorks, and we were just absolutely enthralled with the work that's being done. It's very inspiring. So I'll be sending out notices to everybody this week, but it's May 17th from 1 to 3 at the Village of Algonquin Public Works.
Are you going to have a virtual option for that?
I don't think so, but that's a good question, but we don't have it set up. What's that?
Do we usually record them?
We have been filming, and actually a really good point. So a lot of our talking tours have been filmed and are available on the county's YouTube website. The other one we did with Michelle Zimmerman was looking at the green infrastructure that they have in Algonquin and the cost effectiveness of their natural areas compared to conventional landscaping. But we will be filming that, but I don't know that we'll have a live option, but I'll look into that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
And there I'll strap a camera to my head.
We'll get a GoPro.
All right, thanks, Brian.
Michael, you there? All right.
Just remember, every time I turn my head, you're gonna be getting some really odd angles.
Blair Witch Hunt kind of things, right?
Okay, well, that wraps up the report section. If no one has any future topics that
Next
they want to bring up.
meeting is when? Just so we have it confirmed.
The second Tuesday of May. I
Okay,
believe.
is it still that? I just didn't know because we had to shift.
Okay, you know what, let me adjourn anyone that wants to
Okay.
go, and I'll pull it up.
I was going to ask, are you going to, we'll just check the website to see if it's there? Are you going to send out any notifications on the meeting?
We sent out the notifications for your calendars, should be recurring that second Tuesday of every month.
Yeah.
If it's not, let us know, but that's kind of to the extent that we're gonna be sending anything. And then if for whatever reason we need to cancel or something like that, we'll go ahead and send a cancellation notice through that particular invite. We're gonna try to post every agenda that Friday or as early as possible if we can, so you guys have a little bit more time to look through it. That's gonna be through the meeting portal, so just go on that and download it. But yeah, if anyone does not have it on their calendar or something like that, send me an email, we'll get that corrected for whatever reason.
I have it on the 14th. I just wanted to make sure that it was, that we haven't changed it.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
We were having potentially a scheduling issue with the rooms. I think we're past that. So I know with elections coming up or something like that, if I get notified that, hey, we've got a problem, we may have to cancel that. And then I probably just coordinate with Steve as the chair if we wanted to have a special meeting to, depending on what we had on the agenda, then we can look to get the notice out for that. But at any point, if you guys want to revisit the calendar, we can certainly do that. Otherwise, if this Tuesday works, then we'll just keep it. All right, with that, I'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everyone.